Your brain on climate.
In April 2006, a man hugged a dog. The man was the new leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or the Tories, if you prefer. His name was, and still is, David Cameron. The dog was a husky. We can call the dog Steve, if you like. It was no happy coincidence that the fresh-faced Conservative leader was hugging Steve. Huskies are nice. The Tories, though, had got themselves a reputation for being the nasty party. It wasn't that long ago that Labour leader Tony Blair had won a third term in office, and the Tories looked done for, beaten. It was closing in on 10 years since they'd last been in power. That's a huge time in politics. New ideas and a new image were clearly desperately needed. So David Cameron, the new leader, went big on the planet. He changed the logo of the party to a tree. And I remember this really well because I worked there at the time, he shared a platform with Friends of the Earth where we were campaigning for a climate change law, the world's first climate change law. And in significant part, because of his support and that of his party, 2 years later, the UK adopted that law, the Climate Change Act 2008. Climate Change Act was and still is a Herculean thing to have done. It was the law of the land now for current and future governments that they had to get fossil fuels out of our energy system. Those fossil fuels around which, don't forget, the entire modern economy had been built. Now, plenty of other countries have this law, but the UK then was the first to do it, and the Conservatives heavily backed it. And even more remarkable now, particularly if you live in a country where the politics of what you think about climate change is defined by what party you vote for, like the USA, just 2 decades ago, not only did the Conservatives back it, but only 5 MPs, 5 of any party, voted against it.
My brothers don't die, we just rusty bark.
Fast forward a decade, 2019. Theresa May is now the Conservative Prime Minister. She's the one who originally called the Conservatives the nasty party in the first place. Theresa's not had a brilliant time and she is about to lose her job. But before she does lose her job, one of the very, very last things she does is this.
I believe that we have a moral duty to leave this world in a better condition than what we inherited. And that's why today we're announcing that we will be ending our contribution to climate change by 2050 and legislating for a net zero emissions target.
She signs the UK up to what is called net zero by 2050. Now then, net zero. We're going to need a quick tangent to define that term. It's going to come in useful throughout this episode. Net zero doesn't mean zero emissions. You're allowed to emit some greenhouse gases, like say from making steel, but you've got to make up what you emit by removing the same amount of carbon from the atmosphere, if you can make the sums add up, through like planting trees, which sucks greenhouse gases out. Scientific concept and accounting device, but most importantly for this story, it's an even more ambitious thing for any government to try to do than the existing Climate Change Act. And I feel like I need to hammer this point home here. It was a Conservative Prime Minister what did it. The UK, you see, had a near total parliamentary consensus on the significant stuff of climate action for well over a decade. There were squabbles, but nothing derailed it. There were massive political sparring points to be had. But as we're going to hear in this episode, just a few short years later, that is emphatically no longer the case. As of 2026, when I record, the current position of the Conservative Party is to scrap the Climate Change Act that it helped to introduce in the first place, and to declare that net zero, which it introduced just 7 years ago,
is impossible. We have to get real. Anyone who has done any serious analysis knows it cannot be achieved without a significant drop in our living standards, or worse, by bankrupting us.
The current leader of the party, Kemi Badenoch, has said any prospective new MP who supports net zero will not be allowed to stand for the party. That's how seriously she takes this. And it's not just the Conservatives. Over to her right, there's a new upstart party, Reform UK, currently leading in all the opinion polls, led by Nigel Farage, the populist leader who's one of the architects of Brexit. He calls it net stupid zero, and the local councils that his party are busy winning all over the country are already dismantling the climate action plans happening across Britain, or trying to anyway. Meanwhile, the position of the current Labour government, or at least it was at the time I recorded this, which isn't ideally timed, but never mind, is to be heavily still in favour, not just of net zero, but even more ambitious action. It wants to get basically fossil fuels out of the electricity system in this country in just 3.5 years.
So all these crises have the same ultimate cause, our dependence on fossil fuels. And all of them have the same solution: low cost, homegrown, zero carbon power for our country.
So what you've got, don't worry if you weren't following the detail of that, is a huge gaping divide now between the parties, between left and right, on policy and the details of how much carbon should be cut and what it looks like to do it, but increasingly also on identity.
The man is obsessed. He's got this obsession with net zero, and what it's doing, it's costing us billions of hard
So look,
work.
climate change, net zero, clean power, call it what you want. It has long been a divisive political thing in many countries, and now, finally, for the first time, damagingly, it is here too. The old adage is that a week is a long time in politics. Well, in the space of just a few years, the political right in this country has done a complete reverse ferret. It has gone to war on net zero, a thing they thought was a brilliant idea not very long ago. So what the hell is going on? This isn't a party political broadcast. It's not really a political show. I don't do like the ins and outs of Westminster politics, so thank you for bearing with that potted history of where we got to. We are here to talk about psychology and culture, and why human brains think what they think about climate change and what should be done about it. And no matter where you are on the political spectrum, the story of the UK's creaking splinter in politics on climate action and net zero is really important, and in terms of how and why people form and then change the ideas that they do about climate change, really, really fascinating. So, in this episode, we're going to be finding out why the right have apparently turned against net zero, and what it tells us about the stories we do and don't share about climate change.
Your brain on climate.
So hello, I'm Dave, and welcome to this episode of Your Brain on Climate. It's the show about human brains versus the climate crisis. So, have the right really turned against climate action? And if so, why and what the hell is going on? To find out, in this episode, I'm joined by someone who's just done a major bit of very clever new research looking at just that.
So, Becca, my surname is Massey-Chase. Sometimes people mispronounce that, so it's Massey-Chase.
How do they pronounce it?
Sometimes people say Massey-Chase, but it's definitely Massey.
Okay.
So Becca Massey-Chase and Head of Citizen Engagement at IPPR. Institute for Public Policy Research. So we're a think tank. We're doing think tanky things, policy research, advocacy. I'm based in the economy and environment team, but don't ask me any difficult questions about the economy.
In this chat, Becca tells me the story of what's happened to the political story of climate change in the UK and why. What is it about net zero that righty populists hate? Which of their arguments work with the general public, and why do they work? What bits of psychology, culture, wider narratives are being hooked onto here? And does all of this show that the story that we all hold about climate change might be a little bit less solid and a bit more identity-based than we think?
Whilst the public mood is being tapped into by really effective messaging from the right, that public mood isn't set in stone. That's changeable. People. It's not always been that way, and doesn't always have to be that way. But what the progressives need to get better at is identifying, predicting, and then tapping into the public mood, and also shifting it, building it, and changing it. And, you know, we don't want people to feel disenfranchised and fed up and low trust in the things that are meant to serve them. Like, that's a rubbish way for people to feel. That's sad. That's not good. That's not what I don't like, feeling like that. And I feel like that sometimes. It's not a nice way to feel. So tackling that would be good for everybody.
Now, before we get going properly, just the usual bit of housekeeping. This is a 100% listener-supported podcast. I am truly grateful to the people who chuck in a couple of quid because they love the show, and it really does help keep it going. If you'd like to join them, head over to www.patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate if you can, and I'd be really humbled and pleased. If you can't do that, please do join the very kind people who give me a 5-star review and a rating at your podcast medium of choice. It really makes a massive difference for getting guests, building profile, all the rest of it. And you can email me at hello@yourbrainonclimate.com if you've got any thoughts on the show. And remember, this noise denotes wisdom, which will be coming almost entirely from Becca. So there'll be something in the show notes for you to check out at your leisure. Right, on with it. Here's me and Becca. Over the last couple of years, what has happened to the politics of climate change in this country?
I think there are two important parts to the answer there for that, because there's the politics on the ground in the day-to-day lives of people, and then there's the elite politics. And I think that what's so interesting in the UK with what's happened with climate politics is the separation of those two things. So by what I mean is that at a elite level, at politicians and political actors and political media and that sort of level, there has been a fracturing in the consensus on climate. And that is a newish thing. So, you know, last couple of years, as you say, and you know, I can kind of explain why that's happened and what's happened there. But I think that one of the reasons why I've been thinking about this so much is because that fracturing, that dismantling of the consensus hasn't been reflected in where your everyday member of the public is at on climate. So a few years ago, people were using this word greenlash or net zero backlash, these kinds of ideas that there's been this really big pushback on the consensus that we need to be taking really significant action to reduce emissions and prevent the worst impacts of climate change. That is an elite kind of manufacturing. That is something that people have talked about in those sort of elite circles. And it's easy to think that it's more widespread than it really is because of the level of noise that's being generated around it and because it's something that's talked about so much in the papers. But that isn't how your everyday person is sort of feeling about this. There hasn't been a kind of similar fracturing, you know, and actually across the board, you know, broadly speaking, from not exclusively the case, but broadly speaking, across different political persuasions, different demographics, people still want ambitious, progressive action on climate crisis. That's something that is a mainstream view that hasn't been reflected in the stance that the different political parties are now taking. So historically, you would have had Labour, Conservative, people across different, from left to right, broadly agreeing that this is something that, you know, reducing emissions, something that we needed to do, switching to clean energy, something that we needed to do. And now there's a left and right divide on this subject.
Which is like pretty remarkable that the UK kind of alone really in the world, certainly uniquely to the extent it had it, for 20 odd years in this country, we've had no significant spats about climate change. Unlike if you go to America or Australia or somewhere where like your political identity determines what you think about climate change, right? That kind of thing. We haven't really had that in this country, which is kind of that's remarkable in itself, isn't it?
I think historically there's evidence that Britons are some of the most green supporting people in the world. that is something that unites people across. And maybe that's because we have a history of being kind of nature loving, although I find it hard to imagine other places don't have that history too. And actually, I think our right has historically been seen as the conservers, and then that is in some ways conservers of nature, conservers of things that people hold dear to them. And knowing that that's nature and wildlife and things. So there is, I think, a bit of a legacy of kind of the right as being seen as relatively green in this country, actually. Labour has that history too. They don't shout about it, but it is part of Labour's history as well. And maybe that is unusual that it's kind of unites both sides of the political spectrum here, which, it did used to. It doesn't now.
So say a little bit about what has changed then in the specifically kind of in the politics in the last couple of years, the elite level politics.
Yeah. So if you take your sort of political party level, I think there's two things that have happened that are really interesting, and it's good to be specific about what they are. One is a belief in taking action against climate change. So climate action, and whether that's seen as like the right thing to do and a good thing. And we've seen a real drop off in belief that that's being a good thing to do from the Conservative Party. And that's at a political level. We're not talking about the public who support the Conservatives, but the party member, the Conservative MPs have really dropped off in their support for action on climate. That hasn't happened in the Labour Party. But what you see in the Labour Party is a drop in the belief of the electoral advantage of climate action. So by that, it's people who think that it's a good thing, it's a vote winner, to be firm and clear and active on this as a topic. So those two things have dropped in the last couple of years. And it's really fallen off a cliff for the Tories since the 2024 election. So it's really gone downhill. You've also obviously got the increased presence of Reform. And Reform from the beginning have been very anti-net zero. And really vocally.
Should we say who Reform are, just for people who may not understand? Yeah.
Characterising them is already, I think, probably quite a contentious issue. How you would describe them? I mean, they're the furthest to the right of our mainstream parties. There are parties that are now further to right than Reform, but they are the most right-wing party in the UK that has any kind of big popular support. They emerged to the right of the Conservative Party, who are the traditional sort of right and left. We've moved from, in the UK, a sort of two-party Labour Conservative dominant system to one where there are other voices at play. So, in recent elections, some people have been trying to choose between Liberal Democrats, the Greens, Labour, Conservatives and Reform, and really not known which way it's going to go. That's really new in the UK in British politics. It hasn't been like that until now. But that means the Reform have emerged as a really big contender. And the Conservative Party has really moved to the right as well. So under the current leadership of the Conservative Party, it is now a much more right-leaning version of that party. It's also a much smaller party. They lost a lot of seats at the election. And the people who are left within the party are some of the more right-leaning voices. And
to sort of characterise it, I guess, for kind of international audiences, you've basically got this insurgent party on the right and you've got the main party on the right, both of which are now going, this climate change stuff, this net zero thing is bollocks. And for whatever reason, we will do less of it or none of it, right?
Exactly. So like Reform have YouTube videos that say stupid net zero, net stupid zero means that you'll be net colder and net poorer this winter. Like really hammering it from an equity stance, from a cost. A lot of the arguments that are being made by Reform and the Conservatives are around the cost, around it being unaffordable, around it being something that is silly, is elitist, is aligned with a kind of sort of bureaucratic, government meddling, overreaching, zealotry as well, kind of left fanaticism. There's lots of ways in which it's being kind of characterised as a kind of like ideological pursuit that isn't in the interest of the ordinary man. And that's why it's, there are Reform in this country are a right-wing populist party, and there's a position that they've seen that there's an opportunity to take we talk about whether that's effective or not, but the idea that you can paint climate action as being, you can paint net zero as being something that's being driven by a bureaucratic elite, and actually the interests of your everyday person are not being listened to, and it's being kind of setting up your ordinary person against this sort of faceless or uncaring and unsympathetic sort of elite figure, I think.
So it isn't really news that the populist right, and indeed the mainstream right, appears to be increasingly turning against climate action in the UK. And it's not actually that surprising globally, because after all, climate action has long been an ideological political football in many other countries, where grandstanding politicians, often tiresomely old men, do stuff like take a lump of coal into the Australian Parliament.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops. It's coal. It was dug up by men and women who...
Or snowballs into the US Senate.
2019 has been the warmest year on record. I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball. And that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out. Very unseasonable.
To make some half-assed point about why climate isn't important. And in the States, of course, you've got a president who will literally say stuff like this.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. I've been right about everything. And I'm telling you that if you don't get away from the green energy...
So entrenched is this divide in the States that studies have shown that more than age or gender or class or ethnicity or anything, the number one biggest determiner of how big a problem you're going to say climate change is the political party you're fond of. So if you identify as a Republican, you are massively less likely on average to think that climate change is a problem, or even that it's real. And the interesting question to me has always been why? Like, what's going on? How sincere is the right's opposition to climate action, and in the UK this increasing opposition to net zero? Like, where's it coming from? Do you take it in good faith? Do right-wing populists really and sincerely believe that this thing is a bad idea, or are they just saying so because of who funds them? How much of it is the thing called motivated reasoning, which we all do when we've got an existing view of the world and we set out arguments to defend that view? Or is it all just a little bit more political and cynical than that?
I think there are three main reasons why the right-wing populists in the UK have picked net zero as a thing that they want to make a big noise about and big deal about. And I think there is an ideological component to it. I think there's a sort of ideological, there's the kind of political in terms of political strategy, and then there's your cynical funding, etc. So those are your sort of three things. But I do think it's important to recognise that there is that ideological component, that in the sort of like political framework of the far right in this country, you can paint net zero as being a kind of global imposition that's not in the interests of British people, that if you're someone who's worried about overreach of state, that if you're worried about cost of things, if you're worried about impingements on people's liberties, these are the kinds of things that people to the right of politics in the UK might believe. You can find ways of thinking about net zero in those terms. Now, I'd argue that those would be not the right way to conceive of it at all.
That's because you're a woolly lefty. Because
I'm a woolly lefty.
Yeah, because you want to oppress people underneath the jackboot of communism.
Well, exactly. I think you just really want people to have what's best for them.
They don't. The problem is people don't know, do they? Don't know what's best for them.
But I think there is that sort of, if you're like fiscally conservative, if you're anti-regulation, if you've got libertarian instincts, if you're anti-globalist, then you could see that you could paint net zero, you could paint a picture of net zero that really conformed with your ideology. At that point, you're also just sorting it into like a category of the kind of things that people like you don't like. So you get it like grouped in speeches along with like HR policy and trans rights, and it becomes for those people something that they kind of like group with that stuff. again, that's not how the ordinary everyday person sees it at all. But there's a real, I think, probably conscious effort to kind of group it in that way. So I think that there's that kind of like people like me element that is partly ideological. And then also you might have like an actual political philosophy that maybe was at a bit odds with it. So I think that's the like generous interpretation. Then there's the political idea. So why would it be politically sensible to pick net zero as a target? I mean, I'd argue that actually it's a misjudgment, that actually if you try to pick net zero as a wedge issue, you're barking up the wrong tree, because it doesn't mobilise people enough. There aren't people who are anti-net zero enough that it mobilises their voting intentions. Not very often. It's hardly anybody, really. There aren't people moving from, for example, Labour to Reform because almost no one. There's a tiny percentage of people who do that because of net zero, because of environmental policy. It's not the thing that's moving people. So actually picking it as a wedge issue, I think, was a political miscalculation by Reform. But, they're grasping onto any opportunity that they see. And actually the reason why I guess it's not too crazy an idea for them is that it's not going to fracture their existing voter coalition. So the people who are already voting for Reform aren't going to be pissed off about Reform being anti-net zero. So actually, if they're anti-net zero, they could pick up a couple of votes, because your people who are anti-net zero are scattered across other political parties, and wedge issues are most effective when you've got people in the same party who have different views on them.
Makes you choose, right? It kind of makes you. It's one of those things that makes you kind of go like, are you for this or against it? It kind of puts you in there, and then the answer to that gets you. If you agree with them on it, then you're suddenly
then it pushes you into that.
It pushes into that camp. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and for years and years and years, the EU, the European Union, has become one of those things, and it was sort of a playbook for that, right? Like 40 years ago, people didn't really care one way or the other. In fact, were generally quite supportive, and over a period of 40 years, became a thing where it's like, should we leave the EU? Yes or no? And that's just kind of a thing that you took an instinctive position on.
Yeah, exactly. Net zero, yes or no. And there'll be other issues, and actually things like trans rights are another one of them, where people have it's such a strong part of their identity that they have a position on that it tells them which way they want to vote on it. And I think the thing is that certainly, I think for and against climate, it doesn't do that. But particularly against the people who are against, it isn't mobilising how people vote. It's not just the deciding factor in their voting choices in the UK at the moment. And so it's not the best choice as a wedge issue. But as I say, because it doesn't do any harm in terms of the audience that Reform is already speaking to, I guess that's why you plump for it as an option, because you maybe pick up the odd vote there. And then, yes, so you've got your ideological, you've got your kind of political strategy, and then the cynical take is, and I think it's an important background, which is, we know that the right-leaning parties in the UK have fossil fuel interests. That people who are involved in, the parties, but also in the political institutions, that the sort of think tanks and the sort of the world around those, the media, there's a lots of people who are climate skeptics, who are funded by fossil fuels. There's a lot of that in that ecosystem. And so if you were trying to choose an issue, and it might be one that was an automatic, obvious choice for you. And I guess actually that does overlap with the idea of the kind of ideological side of things, which is that certainly for the Conservative Party, there may be more of a, different for Reform because they're more insurgent, but for the Conservative Party, a sort of sense of wanting the sort of social order and economic order to stay the same. And that's because those people have been well served by that social and economic order. You've been well served by those interests. There are vested interests that have done you well. And so a desire to conserve those things can be both cynical, but also can be kind of part of your overall ideology as well, underscored and propped up by the financial interests and, not wanting to piss off anybody who was going to give you some money, or people who are powerful and have, there are lots of powerful players in this world.
Yes, it's always hard to know, isn't it, with some of this who funds parties stuff, whether or not, in which order it is and which is worse. Like, do they get funded by fossil fuel interests because they think climate change is not that much of a problem, or do they think climate change is not that much of a problem because they get fun? Like, either is bad, and I'm not actually sure it really matters what order that flows in, to be honest.
Yeah. I think there definitely are people who genuinely think that net zero is just a terrible idea. It's not just that they're funded to do that. They do also just believe it. And why they believe it is probably quite complicated, because people are complicated.
So tell us what you've looked into and what you've found, Becca.
So this bit of research was, well, actually, I'll take a step back. Why did I start this bit of research in the first place? And my main reason was I was feeling a bit worried that there was a sense of a backlash against net zero, that there was this idea that there was a green lash sweeping across Europe and the UK was, just the same, and everything, that the tide of opinion was turning against it. And I felt that felt like a bit of an amorphous threat, a bit of a kind of like, this is a thing that we are worried is happening. And I wanted to understand it, to understand what was happening in other places, but particularly what was happening in this context in the UK. And I guess that my hope was that we would find that threat was not this kind of amorphous, threatening, oh my goodness, this is all terrible. But actually, once you unpack it, it demystifies it, and also you can understand it, and then you can tackle it, and also you can understand to what extent it really is a threat. But also it's understanding, well, what are the arguments that are made against net zero? Which ones of those are landing? With whom are they landing? Because once you get into the detail of it, you can understand it better, and then you can tackle it better. And the positive, I think the good news story coming out of this bit of work is actually that the arguments against net zero that are being made by the populist right in the UK, generally speaking, for the most part, aren't really resonating with your ordinary voter, your ordinary person. They're not landing with most people. So arguments like net zero is putting up your energy bills, or net zero is responsible for industrial decline. These are the kinds of arguments that are really made a lot by your right-wing populists. They're the sorts of arguments that you hear, you see them in the news, you see them in the papers. And those sorts of arguments aren't landing with people. They don't really believe it. What is resonating, what people do hear, believe, and sort of understand, and it resonates with their understanding of how the world works and what their life is like, is net zero is not possible, net zero can't be done, it's all a bit hopeless and difficult. And I think understanding that that's what's working in the arguments, that that's where it's landing for people, really guides what you need to do in terms of your response. And it's not a big tackling misinformation campaign. I mean, not to say that that's not important as well, but actually it's about building confidence in the government, that people say, look at what we're doing, we're delivering on this, and it's something that you care about. So there's an opportunity even in tackling that, because whilst the public mood is being tapped into by really effective messaging from the right, that public mood isn't set in stone. That's changeable. People, it's not always been that way and doesn't always have to be that way. But what the progressives need to get better at is identifying, predicting, and then tapping into the public mood, and also shifting it, building it, and changing it. And, we don't want people to feel disenfranchised and fed up and low trust in the things that are meant to serve them. That's the rubbish way for people to feel. That's sad. That's not good. That's not what I don't like, feeling like that. And I feel like that sometimes. It's not a nice way to feel. So tackling that would be good for everybody.
If I heard you right, then we can come to some of these. The arguments are the most sort of persuasive or sticky, or the bit when people like Nigel Farage, leader of Reform, says this. It's the thing that lands the most, which is, look, may or may not be a nice idea and anything, but we can't do that. We can't decarbonise our economy in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Can't be done. Look at what's involved. Can't do that. And that works, not because people have a bloody clue one way or the other whether or not you can decarbonise the economy in 20 years, because they don't think we can do anything. They're just yeah, that sounds right. We can't build stuff in this country anymore. We can't do anything. Britain is broken. And so it's aligning this, again, fuzzy, amorphous concept of a net zero thing with something people do feel, which is a general sense of stuff is broken.
Yeah. Exactly. And there's all sorts of evidence that they can find for that in their day-to-day lives. I think it's particularly vulnerable to that criticism as well, because climate change is so overwhelmingly difficult. It requires systemic change. It requires big solutions. It is something that feels, because it feels really overwhelming and hard. And so it's then especially vulnerable probably to feed that sort of feeling of like, well, I don't trust anybody, and so they definitely can't do this because that thing is particularly hard. And then I guess also that the argument that's landing a lot as well is they're like, what's the point in us doing anything when other global players aren't? And, we're in an international context where there's a whole lot of global stuff happening and it feels quite overwhelming. And
it's not a ridiculous thing to think. I mean, of all of the arguments, the one that I catch myself thinking sometimes is when I hear, so you'll hear this about, in the UK at the time of recording, we're in a horrible heat wave, just coming out of a horrible heat wave, where in May, in this country, we had temperatures of 35 degrees. This is Britain, right? This is not Dubai. That should not be happening. And there's a load of people going around saying, look, we here in the UK need to ramp up our efforts on doing something about climate change because, look, the weather, right? And I do catch myself sometimes going, there's a bit of a disconnect there. There's a little bit of a disconnect between, like, we have to radically restructure our economy here in the next 20 years and the fact that we're only 1% of global emissions. Like, I understand why that's important, but, like, there is something in that argument, I think, that sort of plays to I think you have to explain why that's not the case a bit more to people than you do with some of the other stuff.
I think that's really true. And we found, when we did the sort of message testing stuff for this work, that there's no point because of the US and China type argument was the one that had the highest believability. People just went, yeah, that sounds about right. And also had really high reach. So lots of people had heard their argument. But when we tested kind of other messages that were like a counter argument to that, people got the counter argument and believed it, and it beat that original argument, but they needed the counter argument kind of put to them.
You have to explain it, yeah.
Yeah,
okay,
but sort of like, it's all hopeless and we can't do it. No counter argument beat that. That was the one that was the stickiest. But there's no point because of China and the US. People believe that, but then they also actually prefer arguments like there's lots of different arguments you can argue against that, but people quite like the argument that well, you can't just all say that, then we'd all be going to hell in a handcart. Like that, that's not taking our responsibility. That kind of sort of, we can't all just do nothing kind of argument. And a kind of actually, it's sort of, the argument there's no point doing it kind of assumes that the process of doing it would be bad for you, and actually that's where the kind of co-benefitsy type, the sort of energy independence things, there are reasons why you might do this stuff otherwise type stuff comes in. So that can be quite kind of a helpful counter argument. And then also there's the sort of idea of us as a global leader. People like that idea, the idea that we can show what can be done. We've done a lot, we can do more. We need, for our own protection. So people get really worried when you talk about extreme weather impacts, they're feeling them right now. People really get that. And actually, they want to do anything they can to protect themselves against those things. And so they think, well, if we can do something, and if that shows leadership and encourages others, then we have a responsibility to do that, not just because of a kind of broad idea of doing the right thing and doing the right thing for the future and future generations, but also the idea of just I really don't want these bad things to happen right now.
Your brain on climate.
Hello and welcome back to this episode of Your Brain on Climate. I'm Dave. My voice has gone a bit funny, sorry, it's been a long week. Anyway, we are mid-chat with the researcher Becca Massey-Chase, and we're looking at how the populist right came to hate the idea of net zero and what that reveals to us about how ideas about climate change and climate action are formed in the first place. So what we're going to talk about now is all the stuff that might be going on in our heads when anyone, whether you're on the right or the left, form any view at all about climate change. or climate policy. And kind of what you think about this stuff is like, as we've talked about, partially about like legitimate rational debate. Is X or Y thing a good economic policy, or are the government competent, or should the UK cut emissions if we don't think other people are cutting it? All of that sort of stuff where like you can debate those things. You might not agree with people, but at least there is a discussion in theory to be had. But we've also been hinting at something else going on here, which is where I want to focus on now, which is I think more important in understanding what net zero is, why it's an attractive target to populists. And that thing is vibes. A few years ago, the Financial Times journalist Janan Ganesh wrote a piece that's really stayed with me called The Vibes Theory of Politics.
20 years in and around politics have left me sure of one thing. Most people's ideological commitments are extraordinarily soft. What they think of as a belief is often a post hoc rationalisation of a group loyalty.
His case, with which I agree strongly, is that for all the pretend debating about policies and economics, most people in this country form their views about politics, about most things in life actually, based not on facts, but on vibes. What kind of looks, sounds and feels right.
It is also a matter of vibes and tribes. At a base atavistic level, these are my people. They dress and act like the average of my 10 best friends. If there are some awkward policies in the way, I will reinterpret them.
And good populists understand vibes politics very, very well, I think. Creating vibes about an idea and weaponising it, about a person. And then when they've done that, asking you, here are the vibes. What side are you on? As we've already kind of discussed, right? That's what populism is. It's about making you pick a side. It creates enemies against which it attempts to rally the masses. When lefty populists do it, those enemies are usually things like billionaires, tech company bosses, tax dodgers, oil companies. On the right, the enemies look more like this guy.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. So here I am, on the latest stage of my GB
That is Ed Miliband. It's a rather unflattering clip. He is, or was, depending when you listen, the UK's energy and net zero boss, secretary. He's the one who's trying to speed up, not slow down climate action. And in fact, nearly 20 years ago, he was the minister who took the original Climate Change Act through Parliament, which we talked about at the start. Now look, I have met Ed a few times. He is a lovely, kind, serious, tall and surprisingly handsome dude in real life. But in the court of opinion on the populist right, he is public enemy number one.
We didn't test like association of Ed Miliband with this stuff particularly. I'm sure others have done. What we did look at is a little bit around like association with Labour. So what I think is quite interesting that we, just to take a step back quickly. So one thing that we found in this research is that climate change has dropped down people's lists of things that they are worried, that's like, so we talk about it in terms of the word salience, but how high it is on the list of things that they're worried about, the things that are really important to you. So climate change used to be higher than it is on that list for people in the UK. So we know that people, broadly speaking, believe that it's happening and think it's a bad thing. Generally speaking, they think that it's man-made. It's, it's not just happening, but we're responsible for it. And then in terms of, is it important to you? That's the thing that's kind of gone down a little bit. Now we know
relative to
where it was. Yeah, and relative to other things. So like, there are a huge number of competing priorities for people, cost of living, immigration, all sorts of stuff that are other more pressing concerns in their lives that mean that it's gone down the list of things that is top of the list for them. Now, when something's really important to you, when it's at the top of your list of things that you care about, you're much less vulnerable to like elite messages. So when Reform, when the Times and the Telegraph, so right-wing newspapers in the UK, when they tell you that this thing's really bad, if it's something that you really care about, you're much less likely to move on it. If it's something that you care less about, you're more likely to move your opinion on it. So we know that on net zero, the arguments against net zero aren't really landing, but it is being affected by partisanship. So people aren't moving because they have heard an argument and believed it. They are moving a little bit because the people that they trust and listen to have told them it's bad and it's less important to them, and so they're more likely to move. And that sort of partisan effect is interesting when you think about, as the popularity and trust in the Labour Party's gone down, some people have moved against net zero because of its association with Labour. And I think that is really tricky to counter. But actually the best thing you can do in that scenario is to try and make it as non-partisan as possible. So actually what we probably need in the kind of NGO, charity sector, ecosystem working on climate change in the UK are to find some moderate conservative voices who can try and depoliticise and make this less of a partisan thing. Actually, centre-right voices on this would be one of the best things that the UK could have in terms of kind of making a difference in terms of this issue at the moment. So that, I think, there's one thing that could be done there to try and take the leftiness, the partisanshipiness out of this issue in the UK, like it used to be. That would be really helpful. And there are things that people can do to elevate those sort of maybe more mainstream right of centre voices. There are those voices out there, they just need to be given the platform.
And we can all do that stuff in our lives, can't we? Like we all we can all come across as more or less kind of, partisan and lefty and stuff. And I guess just kind of when talking to anyone about this stuff, the less you can make it seem like you're asking people to choose whether they're left or right or pro or, we can just have a conversation with people about something, the better, right?
Yeah. What I don't want to sort of come across as saying is that this is a highly partisan issue in the UK for the general public, because actually, with the caveat of all the things I've said, actually, as it just still is something that like the majority of people broadly think is a good thing, doing stuff on climate change. Now sometimes that's quite a softly held view, sometimes it's not deep, sometimes for some people it's much more important to them, for other people it's less so. For some people they're a bit ambivalent, they think some stuff is good, less so much the other stuff. But across the board, most people generally are sympathetic and positive on action against climate. In the detail, it gets a bit more complicated. But we also know the answer to the bits where it gets more complicated, because there's loads of really good research on asking the public and people what they really think about things. So when people's views are caveated and when they're contingent on certain conditions, actually, we already know what those conditions are. Loads of research has been done into that. That's the bit that just needs to be delivered well and effectively. But we do know what people broadly think about this stuff overall. And overall, there's like a base level of positivity and ambition, and a lot of people want more to be done. They're worried about it, and it might not be their top priority, but they do want more to happen on it. They do care about it.
Earlier this year, I was sat in a knackered pub in Croydon, listening, fairly discreetly, I hoped, to four pissed-up people sat at the bar, ranting to each other about net zero. Now, what struck me was that what they were talking about was kind of imprecise. They weren't like critiquing specific parts of the carbon pricing regime or exactly how you balance emissions or any of that stuff. Obviously they weren't. They were just kind of, incoherently pissed off at it. Like the idea of net zero was just a bag of shit for them. It was something to rally against. It was responsible in some broad, undefined way for the state of the pub that was on its last legs and the state of Croydon High Street, and the world being all confusing and woke and upsetting. And I realised then, as I listened, that the term net zero, the term in the head of loads of people, is like detached from anything that you might think it means if you've read some science. It's been conjured and blamed like some kind of ephemeral bogeyman. Like, what it specifically means for daily life was fuzzy. But that didn't really matter. And I thought, oh God, I thought we're in trouble here. This thing called net zero, to many people in this country, that is a monster with legs and big teeth, and it's going to eat you. What does this make you think about? What most people think about climate change and stuff like that at all? Like, do we really have a kind of... If you stick a microphone in front of people and you say, hello, I'm here from a polling company, do you think it's important that we do something about climate change? You're saying most people will still say yes. Yes, of course. Yeah, they may not really strongly think that. Some people do. And they may say, yes, but they still kind of basically think it. But what have you concluded or thought about what people are reaching for in their head when they're thinking for that? How fuzzy is the idea? Does it mean the same thing to two people? And can you change, which is what the populists are trying to do, people's associations that easily with something like climate change? It's a big question, but I want to know where you're at.
It's a big question. I mean, I don't know if I have an answer that's terribly well evidenced. I have instincts.
That's all right. This show is all about instincts. Go for it.
I think people get it a bit. They're a bit nervous that they don't really understand the science. They don't really get the detail. I mean, I think that's entirely reasonable because people aren't given the detail. They don't know. It's not something that people are taught enough about or hear enough about, or so how could they? People are, conscious of that gap in their understanding. That's like a chink that makes it vulnerable for people to say, well, this is bad or this is good. And like, people are like, I don't know the answer to that. But I think that people are genuinely worried. They can see how hot it is. They can see the flooding. They can see those things. It does vary across the country. There will be places where, certainly when you go into the specifics, there'll be parts of the country which don't experience the same level of heat, who might not feel that they kind of have as automatic a sense of like, yeah, it's really hot. If it's not so hot.
There's a brilliant example of that on the radio the other day when listened to the radio and the weather forecast was going, it's going to be a really, really hot day, like 35 degrees, whatever. And then someone called in from the Isle of Lewis up in the north of Scotland going, yeah, it's 12 degrees up here. Could you keep things in perspective, please?
Yeah. We have a bit of a bias towards the southeast of England where it was really, really hot. And so, but if you were up in the north of Scotland, maybe not so much. But
like everywhere you live, the climate is changing in the world.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think people do, and they've been taught about, I was taught about it at school a long time ago. People have been talking about this for a really long time. Lots and lots of people will have learnt about it in some level at school and things. So it is something that's just been part of our consciousness for a really long time. I think people have a bit of an understanding of it and a genuine worry about what the future is going to be like. But at the same time, it is hard, and maybe I'm just speaking entirely personally, it is really hard to imagine bad things. It's really hard. I mean, I work on this stuff, and yet there's still a tiny part of me that doesn't believe how terrible all this stuff is going to ever come to be, because I don't want to engage my brain in that and think that that's going to happen. When you're faced with the reality, and there are reports you can read and there's stuff that you can look at that really is terrifying, and I still cannot really get my brain to make sense of that and believe, because I don't know. I'm sure it's a protective mechanism to stop you being, completely paralysed by it all. So I'm sure that I can't be in the minority in feeling that sense of like, intellectually I know this stuff, but emotionally I find it slightly harder to process it, and then sometimes it hits me. And then there's a whole generation of younger people who I think are processing it a lot more emotionally, that it is feeling like a genuinely anxiety-inducing and difficult thing for a lot of people, and people making real life-changing decisions about how they're going to live their lives and whether or not to have children and things like that. People, it is for some people that big an issue. But for the majority of people, I think it is something that they get a little bit, they know. They believe the science, they believe the kind of the sort of official lines on it. They have enough of an understanding to see it as being a scary, bad thing. some of the real world impacts may be hitting their lives, and that's happening more and more for people as their homes flood or, are at risk of falling in the sea, or they had to give birth in a hospital when it was 35 degrees and they had to hold their baby in the corridor because it was so hot in the, in the ward, or their mum's in a care home that's overheating. There are more and more people out there who are experiencing really, exam got cancelled that you've been working towards because it was so hot. Like people whose day-to-day lives will be impacted by this stuff in a really meaningful, visceral way. I don't think we should underestimate how many people that's true for. So, yeah, I think people get it, but they want to actually know more. And that is something from all the citizen engagement stuff that we've done. We've done citizens' juries, we've done engagement across the country. We've talked to people a lot about this stuff. And one of the things that you hear time and time and time again is, I didn't know very much about this. How did I not know? Why did I not know this? I should know this. I want people to know this. I'm going to go away and tell the people this. That's something that you hear a lot of. And actually, just as like a little tangent, you also hear a lot about people saying, why am I allowed to do bad things? Why am I allowed to make that purchasing decision? Or why am I allowed to live in the way that's bad for the world and bad for other people and bad for myself? And I want more action to do something about that. Because I think when it comes to something like net zero, there is a lot of concern about an anxiety, particularly probably from the left, because the left often get kind of critiqued and criticised for this more, but anxiety about telling people what to do. We mustn't ever tell anybody what to do. We mustn't control people's lives, all that kind of stuff. And actually, the UK public have a real ambivalence, actually, I think, to being told what to do. Sometimes they don't want to be, and sometimes they do want to be. And it really matters who's doing the telling and in what the context is. But actually, a lot of the time, people would like more guardrails. They'd like for businesses to have more regulations, for there to be more systems in place to kind of stop the bad things happening. It isn't as clear cut as a sense of just like, we want more freedom and liberty. That isn't necessarily where people are at. They want things to feel safe and the people who are in charge to make the decisions that protect them. And actually, there's a tolerance for being told what to do, or being at least having some actions restricted, because they want to do the right thing. People care. They care about their lives, their children, their neighbours, the world. People have an instinct towards doing the right thing, and want that to be made easy for them.
We like the rules, don't we? Show me the rules. Play fair by
like
the
the
rules.
I mean, that might be maybe that is an interestingly British thing, but there is a very specific group of people who do not like the rules, who hate being told what to do in any description or any form whatsoever. But people who are very concerned about, like, we're not being allowed to drive across our neighbourhoods and we're not allowed to do these things, and it's all a huge infringement on our liberties. But that is quite a specific demographic who is really vocal on that concern. And it isn't the case that that's how everybody feels. But what you do need is you need to build trust then in the people who are making those decisions and telling, setting those parameters and telling people what to do, because actually that's where this, I think it comes back to, and maybe this is the uniting theme of this bit of work, is actually low trust in government, lack of trust in institutions. The things that are meant to be serving us aren't serving us. That's not only true for this topic. Climate action is not the only victim of that problem, but it is a victim of that problem, and that there's a whole set of work that needs to be done to tackle that issue that creates the conditions to do better on this one. What's, I think, interesting is actually there is also potential, as I said at the beginning, if we deliver on good quality decarbonisation policies, do some good stuff that makes it easier for people to reduce emissions, to live well, if you do some good stuff on adaptation and making people's homes and lives safer, that could build confidence, that could increase people's trust in those people who are meant to be helping them and looking after them and serving them. If you do that stuff well, it can be a proof point for competence. It can be a proof point for delivering on the stuff that people care about. So there is a feedback loop. But it's not the only way, and it can't be entirely responsible for dealing with that issue. You can't hold climate change action and climate policy to a totally different standard than you do to everything else, which I think sometimes it's at risk of being held to a very different standard. But there is opportunity as well as risk in this policy area, I think. One thing that I was thinking about before we started this call was the idea that you were going to say, actually not that many people do. Look at the numbers. Is it really true that everybody supports net zero? And because you have your 60% stat of 60% of people think net zero is a good thing. And our research dug into the detail of that and broke that down more. But one of the things that I think was really helpful about that was actually when you say 60% support, you have this imaginary 40% oppose. And actually, that's not the reality. It's not true that 40% of people are against this stuff. The reality is that actually you've got a small number of people who are oppositional, back quarter, and then you've got a group of people who are indifferent, who say, I don't know, who wouldn't know what to think about this issue. And then you've got your interesting group of people who are ambivalent. So you've got your sort of 40% core support, your 4 in 10 people who say, yeah, this is, I'm behind all of this stuff. Net zero and things like it, policy areas that I associate with this, I'm a broad supporter of all that stuff. And then your ambivalent group, which is the group that all the different political players are trying to fight over probably, think that it's broadly a good thing. But once you get into the detail of it, I think some things about this and I think some things about that. But ambivalence is interesting and movability is interesting. And also, we're all really complicated. Like hardly, it's very often that our views don't all make sense together. You believe one thing and another thing, and those two things don't really add up to make sense of, we're all quite complicated and inconsistent in our views. So actually understanding that ambivalence is useful and interesting. But broadly speaking, I do think that kind of idea that the majority of people support this stuff still stands, because I think a lot of that ambivalence is to do with the sort of conditions on which this stuff comes. So yes, as long as, and you can do something about that as long as. So I do think you can assume that support is there for the taking.
There to be lost, right?
There to be lost, exactly.
There to be lost. Yeah. So don't lose it.
Well, that's it. No own goals, please, on this stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Your Brain on Climate with me, Dave, and Becca Massey-Chase from the think tank IPPR. I've put a link to Becca's brilliant report in the show notes. I hope you enjoy it. If you've made it this far, you must have enjoyed yourself a little bit, so if you want to say thank you, please do take 30 seconds to give this show a 5-star rating on your podcast medium of choice and write a quick review. And if you really enjoyed it, you could chuck in the price of a cup of tea to support the running costs of this esteemed organ over at patreon.com/YourBrainOnClimate. I'll be back soon. Tell a friend, tell the socials if you like this show, but for now, look after yourself and I will see you very, very soon, unless you see me first. Never quite sure what that means. Anyway, okay, bye. Bye now. Bye. Okay, no, that's it. Bye.